I want you to close your eyes for a second. Seriously, just humor me here. Imagine you are standing right in the middle of the Saudi Arabian desert.
Okay, I am picturing it. Very hot, I imagine.
Unbearably hot. It is the height of summer, so we are talking 110 degrees Fahrenheit easily, blinding sun, endless shifting sand everywhere, and then slicing right through that absolute emptiness, you see a wall. But not a normal wall.
No, not even close to a normal wall.
This thing is 500 meters tall. That is significantly taller than the Empire State Building, and it is clad entirely in glass mirror, so it reflects the desert back at itself. It almost disappears into the heat haze like a glitch in the simulation. But the wildest part is not the height, it is the length.
Yeah, that is where the scale becomes genuinely hard to process for a human brain.
It stretches for 170 kilometers. That is 110 miles, a single continuous building just cutting across the Arabian Peninsula like a scar. And inside, no cars, no streets, just 9 million people living in this climate-controlled, artificial, eternal spring.
It sounds exactly like the cover art for a 1970s sci-fi novel. Or what, maybe a fever dream.
It really does. But for the last 5 years, this was not fiction. This was the line, the absolute crown jewel of Saudi Arabia's Inno mega project, the most ambitious construction project in human history.
Without exaggeration. The budget, the engineering, the sheer hubris of it, it was pharaonic. It was meant to be the pyramids of the digital age.
But we have to use the past tense now, don't we? Because today is Thursday, February 26th, 2026, and the world looks very, very different than it did when those glossy, futuristic renderings first dropped a few years ago.
It certainly does. We are sitting here in early 2026, and the narrative has shifted fundamentally. We are not talking about when they will finish it anymore. We are asking what went wrong and is it really, truly over?
And that is exactly our mission today for you, the listener. We're not here to just gawk at the cool concept art, although we will definitely talk about how wild it was. We're here to conduct a post-mortem. We have a massive stack of sources for this deep dive. Confidential internal audits that leaked reports from the Wall Street Journal and Bloomberg, deep mathematical studies from the Vienna Complexity Science Hub, and the project's own turbulent timeline from its big announcement in 2021 to the suspension news that hit us late last year in 2025.
And what I absolutely love about this stack of sources is that it covers the full spectrum of why things fail. We have the physics, like why a line is actually a terrible shape for a city. We have the economics of where exactly $1 trillion went. We have the human cost, which is the part that so often gets buried under the CGI videos and the hype.
So welcome to the deep dive. Let's figure out how the city of the future became a ruin before it was even finished.
Let's do it.
To understand the fall, I think we have to understand the height of the ambition. Let's rewind to the beginning. 2021. The announcement drops. And the market, I mean, I have never seen anything like it. It was everywhere.
It was inescapable. YouTube ads, Instagram billboards in Times Square. And it was effective, too. They were not just selling real estate. They were selling a completely new paradigm of human existence. The core pitch was something they called zero-gravity urbanism.
Zero-gravity urbanism. It sounds incredibly cool, but let's unpack that for a second. What does that actually mean in practice?
Well, think about how traditional cities work. They're two-dimensional. They sprawl out. Think of Los Angeles or Phoenix. Endless suburbs, massive traffic concrete paving over everything. The line of proposed stacking the city vertically. So you have a footprint that is only 200 meters wide.
200 meters. That is incredibly narrow. That is what? Maybe 3 city blocks?
Roughly, yes. But because you stack it 500 meters high, you minimize the land use. The pitch was that you protect 95% of the surrounding nature because you are not paving over it. You are just slicing through it with this narrow wedge.
And inside this slice, the promise was essentially a utopia. I remember the specific claims so clearly. 0 cars, 0 streets, 0 carbon emissions.
That was the Civilization 2.0 pitch. The idea was that by eliminating cars, you eliminate the noise, the pollution, and the danger. Instead of traffic, you have the 5-minute city.
Right. We hear about the 15-minute city in urban planning all the time, like in Paris or Melbourne. The idea that you can walk to your grocery store or school in 15 minutes, but they wanted to cut that to 5.
Yes. The claim was that all your daily needs, clinics, schools, shops, parks would be layered vertically within a 5-minute walk of your front door. You just take an elevator up or down, walk a block, and you were there.
Which sounds fantastic. I mean, who doesn't want that? But here is where my brain starts to itch a little bit. If the city is 170 kilometers long, what if my job is on the other side? What if my best friend lives 100 kilometers away? Walking 5 minutes is not going to cut it.
Exactly. You cannot walk 100 kilometers for a cup of coffee. And that is where the spine comes in. This was the technological backbone of the whole project.
The spine. Sounds a bit ominous, actually, doesn't it?
It does a bit. It was an underground transportation layer beneath the city modules. They promised a high-speed rail system that could take you from one end of the city to the other, the full 170 kilometers in just 20 minutes.
Okay, I want to pause there because we need to do some back-of-the-napkin math on that claim. 170 kilometers in 20 minutes.
Right. Let's look at the velocity.
If you do the division, that implies an average speed of 510 kilometers per hour.
Which is fast. Very fast.
That is faster than the maglev in Shanghai. That is faster than the TGV in France. And that is the average speed.
Correct. And that distinction matters immensely. Because a train acts like a bus, it has to stop to let people off. You cannot just teleport from point A to point B without stopping. If this train has to stop at stations to actually serve the 9 million residents along the line, it has to decelerate, stop open doors, close doors, and accelerate again.
So to maintain an average of 510 kilometers per hour with stops, the top speed would have to be what? Sonic the Hedgehog speeds?
It becomes physically impossible very quickly, or at the very least, biologically uncomfortable. The G-forces required to accelerate and decelerate that frequently just to maintain that average speed would make your morning commute feel like a roller coaster launch. You would be spilling your coffee on the ceiling.
So right off the bat, in the glossy brochure, we have a massive physics problem.
We do. It was a promise that sounded amazing, but just crumbled under basic scrutiny. But the vision was not just about transport. It was about intelligence. This was supposed to be a cognitive city.
Cognitive city? That means AI, right?
Massive AI. The proposal was that the city itself would be watching everything. It would use predictive models to anticipate your needs before you even had them.
Like the elevator knows you are running late, so it holds the door, that kind of thing.
On a much grander scale than that.
Yeah.
But there was a detail in the leaked documents that I found fascinating and honestly a little dystopian. They proposed that residents would be paid for their data.
Paid? Like a wage?
Sort of. The documents suggested a model where your data, your location, your health stats, your consumption habits was a commodity. By submitting it to the central city operating system, you would receive credits or direct payments.
That feels incredibly coercive.
It does. It reframes privacy not as a fundamental right, but as a luxury you simply cannot afford to keep. If you are low income, can you really afford not to let the city watch you flush the toilet?
Here is your paycheck for letting us track your heart rate all day.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But again, in the marketing phase, this was spun as ultimate efficiency, the city that knows you. It was the absolute centerpiece of Saudi Vision 2030. We really have to remember the geopolitical context here.
Right, Vision 2030, this is Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman's baby. The goal is to get Saudi Arabia off the oil IV drip.
Precisely. They know the oil era is ending eventually. They need to diversify their economy. The line was supposed to be an economic engine, a free trade zone, a tourist hub, a tech incubator. They projected it would create 460,000 jobs. They projected it adding billions to the domestic GDP. It was not just a home, it was a massive business plan.
A business plan wrapped in a giant mirror.
A very, very expensive mirror.
So that was the dream, a linear, eco-friendly, AI-powered paradise. But as they say, plans are useless, but planning is indispensable. Or in this case, maybe the plan was the core problem from the very start, because when you actually look at the geometry of a line, it gets weird.
It gets very weird. And interestingly, it is not a new idea at all. We found this really cool historical context in the source material. The line was not the first time someone tried this.
Really? Who else was crazy enough to try to build a 100-mile-long hallway?
Well, go all the way back to 1882. A Spanish urban planner named Arturo Soria proposed a linear city based on tram lines. He thought cities should just grow organically along transportation routes. It was very practical, very industrial for the time.
Logical enough for 1882, I suppose.
Then in the 1950s, Yona Friedman proposed a spatial city. But the really relevant one, and the one that makes the line look incredibly ironic today, is from the 1960s, an Italian avant-garde architecture group called Superstudio.
Superstudio, that sounds like a Marvel villain lair. Or a really intense disco club.
Their concept was called the Continuous Monument. It was this massive grid-like structure that wrapped around the entire world. It looked almost exactly like the line monolithic mirror-clad, totally featureless.
So A&M just copied their homework.
They copied the aesthetic, absolutely, but they missed the point entirely. Superstudio's Continuous Monument was satire.
Wait, really?
Yes, it was an art project designed to completely critique modernism and capitalism.
Yeah.
They were essentially saying, if you carry modern urban planning to its logical, rigid conclusion, you get this soulless, horrific wall that destroys nature and individuality. It was a warning. It was dystopian art.
And Saudi Arabia looked at the warning and said, let's build that.
Let's put a $1 trillion price tag on it. It is the ultimate irony. They tried to turn a dystopian architectural critique into luxury real estate.
That is mind-blowing. It is literally like building Jurassic Park after reading the book and thinking it is an instruction manual. But let's get away from the art history for a second and look at the hard math. Because there's a very specific reason we build cities in circles or blobs, right?
There is. And to explain this, we have to look at a brilliant study from the Complexity Science Hub in Vienna. They ran a massive mathematical simulation comparing the line to what they called the circle.
Right, line versus circle.
They took the exact same population, 9 million people, that took the exact same square footage. And they asked a simple question. How easy is it to see your friends?
Okay, basic urban connectivity.
Right. In a linear city that is 170 kilometers long, if you pick two people completely at random, the average distance between them is 57 kilometers.
57 kilometers, that is a haul. That is not, let's grab coffee. That is a planned day trip.
Exactly. Now take those exact same 9 million people and push them into a circle with the exact same density. The radius of that circle would only be about 3.3 kilometers. The average distance between two random people drops to 2.9 kilometers.
Wait, 57 kilometers versus 2.9 kilometers.
Yes, it is a factor of 20. The circle is mathematically vastly superior for connectivity. It minimizes travel time by its very nature.
This completely undermines the 5-minute city promise. They said everything would be close.
Some things would be close. Your local grocery store might be close. But your choices are severely limited. In a circle, you have 360 degrees of options to explore. In a line, you only have two directions, left or right.
And the Vienna study looked at active mobility too, right? Like walking and cycling.
This was the most damning part for me, honestly. In the line, because everyone is spread out so incredibly far, walking is basically useless for anything other than visiting your immediate next-door neighbors. The study found that only 1.2% of the population is within walking distance of you.
So you are totally isolated from 98.8% of your own city unless you get on a train.
Correct. Whereas in the circular model, 24% of the population is walkable. So the line forces you to be entirely dependent on the transit system. And that introduces the massive issue of resilience.
It's a single point of failure.
Exactly. Imagine a fire, mechanical breakdown, a terrorist attack. In a normal city like London or New York, if a subway line goes down, you take a bus, you hail a cab, you walk a different route, you literally go around the block.
But in a line, there is no around the block.
There's only the line. If the spine breaks, the city is severed. It is paralyzed. You cannot route around the problem. From a systems engineering standpoint, it is incredibly fragile.
It feels like they chose the shape strictly because it looked cool on a map or in a rendering, not because it functioned well for actual human beings.
That is the textbook definition of form over function. And we have not even touched the environmental impact yet.
The zero carbon promise.
Which heavily refers to operations. Like, once we build it, it will run on solar. Great. But building it, that is a gigantic carbon bomb.
Because you have to build a glass wall 500 meters high and 110 miles long. That requires a lot of stuff.
Philip Oldfield from the University of New South Wales ran the numbers on this. He estimated the embodied carbon, meaning the carbon emitted just to manufacture the materials, the steel, the concrete, the glass, would be around 1.8 gigatons of CO2 equivalent.
1.8 gigatons. That is hard to even picture.
To put it in perspective, that is more than the annual emissions of the entire United Kingdom, 4 times over.
So you basically burn the planet to build a city that promises to save the planet.
It is the ultimate paradox of greenwashing on a gigaproject scale. And then you have to consider how you are killing the local ecosystem. Let's talk about the mirror itself.
The giant bird killer.
It is a 500-meter-tall, continuous barrier. Migratory birds fly across Saudi Arabia all the time, millions of them. They do not have radar. They just see a reflection of the open sky.
So they just fly right into it.
It cuts crucial migration routes entirely in half. It stops land animals from crossing the desert. You are effectively building a dam, but for biology instead of water. It completely contradicts the whole living in harmony with nature branding. It is an ecological severing of the entire landscape.
We have talked about the math, the physics, the birds. But there is a much darker side to this story that we need to address. Because when we say building in the desert, we tend to imagine empty sand, just dunes, Lawrence of Arabia-style emptiness.
But it was not empty. And this is the part of the deep dive where we really have to get serious. This land in the Tabuk province is the historic homeland of the Huetat tribe. They have lived there for centuries long before the Saudi state even existed.
And you cannot build a 170-kilometer-long city without moving the people who are currently in the way.
You can't. And the displacement process was, well, brutal is the word used by human rights organizations like ALQST.
Our sources highlight reports of forced evictions, entire villages being bulldozed.
But it goes beyond just losing property. There was actual violence. We need to talk about Abdulrahim al-Huwaiti.
This was back in 2020, right? When the project was just barely getting started.
Yes, April 2020. Abdulrahim was a resident who absolutely refused to sign the papers handing over his home. He became a sort of accidental activist. He started posting videos on social media.
I remember seeing descriptions of these videos in the source material. He was documenting the security forces physically surrounding his house.
He said, and this is a direct quote from one of his videos, "I would not be surprised if they come and kill me in my home and put a weapon next to my body and say he was a terrorist."
And then what happened?
And then shortly after, he posted that he was shot dead by Saudi special forces.
Inside his own home.
Inside his own home. The government claimed he opened fire first. But given his videos predicting exactly that scenario, it sent a massive chill through the entire region. It was a very clear message: get out or else.
And it did not stop with him, unfortunately. There were literal death sentences handed out.
Yes. In October 2022, a specialized criminal court sentenced 3 members of the Huetat tribe, Shadli Ibrahim and Atullah, to death.
Sentenced to death for what exactly? Terrorism.
Murder. The official charges were vague, related to disrupting the peace and opposing the guardian. But effectively, it was for resisting the eviction, for getting in the way of the line.
It is genuinely hard to reconcile that reality executing people to build a futuristic utopia with the glossy marketing videos of happy families and the lush indoor gardens.
It creates a severe moral cognitive dissonance. And it had real tangible consequences for the project. Western companies started getting very nervous about the optics.
I read about solar winds in the Bloomberg report.
Right, a major corporate partner. They pulled out specifically citing these human rights violations. They said their ESG charters, their corporate ethics rules, simply would not allow them to participate anymore.
And then you have the architects jumping ship.
That was a huge blow to the international prestige of the project. Sir Norman Foster, for instance, one of the most famous architects alive today, he was sitting on the advisory board. He quit. Francine Hubin from Mekane, she quit. They could not put their names on a project that was literally killing people to break ground.
And we have not even touched on the rights of the people who would actually live there eventually. We mentioned the AI surveillance earlier.
The surveillance city aspect. Digital rights experts like Vincent Mosco were sounding the alarm from day one. When you combine a state with a very poor track record on human rights with a city infrastructure literally designed to track every footstep, every purchase, every heartbeat.
It becomes a panopticon, a digital prison.
It does. If the government can sentence you to death for refusing to move, what can they do with a complete immutable log of your private conversations and movements? The paid-for-data scheme just looks like a massive trap to get people to sign away their civil liberties for convenience.
So we have a project that defies physics, destroys the environment, and tramples human rights. But historically speaking, if you have enough money, you can brute force your way through a lot of problems. And Saudi Arabia has incredibly deep pockets, so what actually killed it?
Money ran out. Or rather, the patience for spending it did.
Let's look at the timeline of the collapse, the unraveling, as we call it.
So 2021 to 2023 was the pure hype phase. Excavators were out there moving sand. They were digging a massive trench along the entire 170-kilometer length. It really looked like it was happening.
But by 2024, the rumors started leaking out.
The scaling back phase. Yeah. This was the very first crack in the mirror. Bloomberg broke the massive story that the first phase, which was supposed to be a significant chunk of the city, had been severely cut.
Cut by how much exactly?
They went from promising 170 kilometers down to just 2.4 kilometers.
2.4. That is just an airport runway. That is not a city. That is basically a large shopping mall.
It was a 98% reduction in scope overnight. The population goal dropped from 1.5 million residents by 2030 down to maybe 300,000 if they were lucky.
What caused such a massive sudden drop? Was it just global oil prices dipping?
Oil prices fluctuate, sure, but the real issue was the budget completely ballooning out of control. Estimates for the total cost started hitting $1 trillion. Even the Public Investment Fund, the PIF, the Saudi Sovereign Wealth Fund, They blinked. They realized the return on investment just was not there.
And then came the internal audit in 2025. This is the juicy corporate drama part of the deep dive.
Oh, the audit was absolutely devastating. The Wall Street Journal got their hands on the details. It was not just a case of, hey, we are over budget. It was a case of we are being actively lied to.
The report specifically found evidence of deliberate manipulation.
Exactly. Project managers were under immense pressure to meet completely impossible deadlines set by the Crown Prince. So they were essentially cooking the books. They were hiding delays, underreporting their costs, and vastly overstating their progress.
It is the classic dictator's dilemma. If you bring the boss bad news, you get fired, or worse. So everyone just lies and says everything is great, boss, until the whole thing inevitably collapses under its own weight.
Precisely. And the final collapse came in late 2025. In August, the PIF officially wrote down $8 billion on its giga-projects. They basically admitted publicly this money is just gone.
And then the date that matters most for this timeline, September 16th, 2025.
The day the diggers finally stopped, the PIF issued a formal suspension order. Work on the main construction sites completely halted.
And that brings us exactly to today, late February 2026. What is the status right now on the ground?
Pure silence. The international media is broadly calling it a likely failure. There are thousands of migrant workers stranded in desert camps waiting for back pay. The executives like CEO Nabil Nasser, they are long gone, fled the ship.
And the high-profile architects who stayed on, firms like Zaha Hadid Architects or Morphosis.
They are still technically contracted, sure, but their designs are just gathering digital dust on a server somewhere. Yeah. Beautiful renders will live forever on the internet, but the actual steel is not being ordered.
It is a truly staggering story. In just 5 years, we went from the biggest architectural announcement in human history to a silent, empty trench in the desert.
It is the ultimate arc of hubris. It is a modern-day story of Babel.
So what is the grand lesson here? What is the core takeaway for you listening to this?
I think it is a profound lesson about top-down versus organic urban planning.
Expand on that a bit.
Real cities, places like London or Tokyo or New York, they are messy. They grow organically over centuries. They start as a small market at a crossroads or a natural port. They expand, they contract. They constantly adapt to the actual needs of the people living in them. They are biological in a way.
And the line.
The line was completely imposed. It was a strict mathematical abstraction forced onto the real physical world. It prioritized the visual impact. The Instagram shot the mirror wall reflecting the sun over the functional reality of how humans actually live and interact.
It tried to force humans to fit the architecture instead of building architecture to fit the humans.
Exactly. And physics always wins in the end. Economics always wins. You simply cannot design a complex society in a vacuum.
I want to leave everyone listening with one very specific provocative image. You mentioned it in your notes earlier, and I cannot stop thinking about it. The hidden marina.
Yes. This is by far the most honking image for me from all the reports. One of the very few things they actually finished digging was the massive hole for the hidden marina. It was supposed to be this huge artificial harbor inside the line where all the billionaire yachts would dock.
They moved millions of cubic meters of sand just to dig this out.
Millions. A giant empty basin carved into the crust of the earth, just waiting for water that will never ever come, waiting for luxury yachts that will never be built.
And now
the desert does what the desert always does. The wind blows, the sand moves.
it is filling back in.
Slowly but steadily. In a few years, it will just be a slightly weird depression in the dunes. Nature is completely reclaiming the dream.
It is the ultimate modern ruin, a massive testament to ambition without foundation.
Dream or dust? It looks like the dust definitely won this round.
On that somewhat cheery note, thank you for guiding us through this absolute wreckage of a project.
Always a pleasure to dig into the details with you.
And thank you for listening to this deep dive. If you enjoyed unpacking this massive failure, keep your eyes on your feed. We will catch you on the next one. Welcome, everyone, and thank you so much for joining us today. You are in for a truly fascinating ride.
Absolutely. It's great to be here.
We are embarking on a highly curated exploration into something that you have, well, undoubtedly heard of. Maybe you've even lived with it or have family members who do, but you likely don't fully understand it on a strict mechanical level.
Most people don't. to be honest.
Right. And our mission today is to cut straight through the clinical jargon surrounding one of the most common yet fundamentally misunderstood conditions in the entire world. We are taking a deep dive into diabetes.
And it really is a condition that touches almost everyone's life in some capacity, right? Whether that's personally or just by observing the massive shifts in global public health over the last few decades.
Yeah, you see the headlines everywhere.
Exactly. Yet the actual mechanics of it, the biological domino effect that happens inside the body, that remains a mystery to the general public.
Yeah.
We tend to treat the word as a catch-all for, blood sugar issues.
Just watch your sugar, basically.
Right, which severely undercuts the complexity of what is actually a systemic cellular crisis.
Which is exactly why we are pulling from a massive, comprehensive source document today. We are breaking down a highly detailed 2026 Wikipedia master document on diabetes. And to be clear, our goal is not to just sit here and read a medical textbook to you.
That would be incredibly dry.
So dry. No,
Yeah.
our goal is to extract the most surprising, the most fascinating, and the most actionable insights from this text. We want to bypass all that surface-level advice and get right down to the core of the pathophysiology, the bizarre history, and the global impact, so you walk away truly well-informed.
And the sheer scale of the information available in this document is staggering. Primarily because the scale of the condition itself has forced an unprecedented level of global medical research.
Staggering is honestly the only word for it. Just to put this in perspective and grab your attention right out of the gate, as of 2024, an estimated 828 million people are living with diabetes.
It's hard to even conceptualize that number.
828 million. That is 1 in 7 adults globally. It is an absolute epidemic, and the numbers have completely blown past earlier medical projections. They estimated we wouldn't even hit the 783 million mark until the year 2045.
Yeah, we are decades ahead of the worst-case scenarios.
Decades.
It represents a profound, rapid shift in human health.
Mm-hmm.
But to really grasp why those macro statistics matter, we have to look inward. From a strictly biological standpoint, what happens in diabetes is a brilliant, albeit deeply flawed, mechanism.
Flawed in what way?
Well, the body is reacting to a perceived crisis in a way that makes complete logical sense on a cellular level, even though the end result is systemic damage. It's basically an evolutionary defense mechanism operating in the completely wrong context.
It's the ultimate biological paradox, and I want to start with the history of how we even identified this paradox, because the origin of our understanding is incredibly visceral. The etymology alone tells a whole story.
It really does.
The word diabetes comes from ancient Greek, specifically coined by Apollonius of Memphis around 230 BCE, and it translates directly to a passer through or a siphon.
Which is a highly evocative image. Think about it. A siphon paints a picture of a body that cannot hold on to its own vitality, where fluids are essentially passing straight through the human form without being utilized.
Just draining away.
Exactly. And that was the primary inescapable observation in the ancient world. The Greek physician Aretaeus of Cappadocia in the 2nd century CE described it as a disease characterized by the excessive and uninterrupted discharge of urine.
And didn't the Roman physician Galen have a pretty graphic term for it, too?
He did. He went a step further and categorized it as diarrhea of the urine.
Wow. They certainly did not mince words back then.
No, they were incredibly literal.
It paints a really grim picture of a patient just wasting away. But the second half of the modern medical name mellitus bridges the gap between recognizing that massive fluid loss and identifying what was actually leaving the body, right?
Right. The addition of mellitus happened much later in 1675 by an English physician named Thomas Willis. Mellitus is a Latin word meaning honey sweet. And Willis added this classification based on a very specific, very hands-on diagnostic method.
The taste test.
The taste test. He and others before him realized the urine of these patients was literally sweet to the taste.
Which feels like a monumental leap in clinical observation, but also a slightly gross one for the physician.
Very gross by modern standards. But this sweetness wasn't just a 17th century European discovery either. Ancient Indian physicians around the 6th century CE, along with Greek, Chinese, and Egyptian doctors, all noticed that the urine of these specific patients attracted ants and other insects.
Nature's diagnostic tool.
Exactly. The Indian physicians actually classified the disease as madhumaya, which translates directly to honey urine. So without any modern blood tests, they used the natural world around them to identify the body was aggressively expelling excess sugar.
Okay, let's unpack this. They identified the symptom perfectly. The body is dumping sugar. But understanding why requires looking at the internal energy economy.
Right. We need to look beyond that outdated middle school biology analogy of insulin simply being a key that fits into a cellular lock. The actual pathophysiology is a complex, really elegant signaling cascade.
So let's break that cascade down for everyone. We consume food, which is broken down into glucose, which is the primary fuel for the trillions of cells functioning like an engine inside the body. But that glucose floating in the bloodstream cannot permeate the cell membrane on its own. It requires a transport mechanism.
Correct. So the pancreas contains specific clusters of cells called the islets of Langerhans. And within those clusters, beta cells are constantly monitoring your blood glucose levels. When glucose rises after a meal, these beta cells release the hormone insulin.
And insulin goes into the blood.
Yes, it circulates and binds to specific receptors on the surface of your muscle and fat cells. This binding triggers a complex intracellular signal, which essentially summons glucose transporters, specifically one called GLUT4, from deep inside the cell to rise up to the surface membrane.
Oh, so the transporters literally move to the surface to grab the sugar.
Exactly. Once there, these transporters pull the glucose out of the blood and into the cell to be burned for energy or stored. It is a tightly controlled, highly sensitive feedback loop.
And diabetes is the systemic failure of that specific loop. Either the pancreas stops producing the insulin signal entirely, or the cells become resistant to the signal, meaning those GLUT4 transporters never make it to the surface. Either way, the fuel gets completely trapped in the bloodstream.
And this is where we see the tragic brilliance of the body's response. Because the glucose cannot get into the cells, those cells are quite literally starving. They're completely deprived of energy.
Even though they are surrounded by it.
Exactly. So they send out biochemical panic signals. The central nervous system registers that the body is starving to death, despite the blood being absolutely overloaded with nutrient fuel.
So the body initiates emergency protocols to try and save itself.
Right. It triggers two major metabolic processes. First, glycogenolysis, which is the breakdown of stored glucose called glycogen in the liver. The liver acts as a reservoir, and it just starts dumping its reserves into the blood.
Trying to feed the starving cells.
Right. And second, it initiates gluconeogenesis, where the body starts generating brand new glucose from non-carbohydrate sources like amino acids. The liver is desperately trying to feed what it believes are starving tissues by flooding the system with even more sugar.
Which compounds the crisis exponentially. The body is drowning in glucose, yet starving for it. And this systemic failure manifests in what the medical community refers to as the classic 3 Ps of diabetes symptoms.
The physical endpoints of this internal derangement.
Yeah.
The first P is polyuria, meaning excessive urination. The kidneys act as the body's filtration system, reabsorbing essential nutrients and expelling waste. But they have a strict renal threshold for glucose. When the blood sugar concentration exceeds that threshold, the kidneys simply cannot reabsorb it all.
And the excess glucose spills over into the urine.
It spills over.
And glucose isn't just a passive molecule, right? It fundamentally changes the fluid dynamics in the kidneys.
It does. Glucose is an osmotically active molecule. Think of it like a microscopic sponge. As it passes through the renal tubules, it physically exerts osmotic pressure, dragging water out of the body's surrounding tissues and into the urine along with it. This creates a massive, unnatural volume of urine production.
That is the literal siphon Apollonius of Memphis observed all those centuries ago. The body is forcefully draining its own water to flush out the toxic levels of sugar, which instantly triggers the second P, polydipsia, or profound excessive thirst.
Yes. The fluid loss from that osmotic diuresis is so severe that it begins to deplete the intracellular water volume. The body is dehydrating rapidly, prompting the brain's thirst centers to scream for water replacement. You drink continuously, but the water just gets pulled right back out by the excess glucose.
It's a relentless cycle, and the final P loops back to the cellular starvation we talked about. Polyphagia, or excessive hunger. The intracellular glucose deficiency stimulates the appetite centers in the brain.
You feel starving.
Yeah, so you eat, but because the insulin signaling is broken, the new fuel just gets trapped in the blood, restarting the entire vicious cycle all over again.
And if left unchecked, this metabolic spiral leads to diabetic ketoacidosis, which is an acute, life-threatening emergency.
That's the DKA you hear about.
Exactly. Since the body cannot access glucose, it aggressively shifts to burning fat for energy. This rapid fat breakdown floods the bloodstream with acidic byproducts called ketones. The blood pH drops, becoming dangerously acidic.
And there's a really specific scent associated with that, isn't there?
There is. A hallmark sign is the patient's breath smelling strongly of acetone, very much like nail polish remover, as the lungs try to exhale the volatile ketones.
It is a devastating cascade, but how a person arrives at this point varies wildly depending on the underlying pathology. We hear about type 1 and type 2 constantly, but looking at the clinical definitions in the text, they are functionally entirely different diseases that just happen to share the same symptom of high blood sugar.
They represent two distinct routes to the exact same systemic failure. Type 1 diabetes, which accounts for roughly 5 to 10% of all cases globally, is fundamentally an autoimmune disorder.
The body attacking itself.
Yes. For reasons that involve a really complex interplay of genetic susceptibility and environmental triggers, the body's own immune system makes a catastrophic error. It deploys T cells to specifically target and destroy the insulin-producing beta cells in the pancreas.
The factory is burned down, basically.
Completely destroyed. The body produces zero insulin. This usually presents abruptly, frequently in youth, which is why the outdated terminology was juvenile onset diabetes, though adults can and do develop it.
And then on the other end of the spectrum is type 2.
Right, comprising about 95% of all global cases.
Hmm.
Type 2 is insidious, characterized by a slow, gradual onset of insulin resistance. In this scenario, the pancreas is still manufacturing insulin.
So the factory is still working.
It's working overtime, actually. In the early stages, the pancreas often pumps out massive, elevated amounts of insulin to try and force the resistant cells to respond. But over years of this hyperinsulinemia, the overworked beta cells eventually exhaust themselves and fail.
And then you get a subsequent drop in insulin production as well.
Exactly.
The conversation around type 2 almost exclusively centers on lifestyle, diet, exercise, obesity. But looking at the genetic data from the twin studies in the source document completely rewired my understanding of the hereditary risks.
What's fascinating here is the monozygotic twin concordance rates. They are highly illuminating. When researchers study identical twins who share 100% of their DNA, the data upends common assumptions. We tend to view type 1 as the purely genetic disease. Yet if one identical twin develops type 1 diabetes, the other twin only has about a 50% chance of developing it.
Which clearly indicates that while you may inherit the genetic susceptibility-specific HLA genotypes that prime the immune system for an attack, something in the environment has to pull the trigger.
A viral infection, a toxin, something flips the switch.
Contrast that with type 2 diabetes. The concordance rate among siblings and identical twins is actually significantly higher for type 2 than for type 1.
It is.
Meaning the genetic predisposition for insulin resistance is incredibly strong, much stronger than people realize.
It demonstrates how profoundly intertwined shared genetics and shared environments are. You inherit a robust metabolic predisposition for how your body handles fat storage and insulin sensitivity, and then your built environment, your diet, and your lifestyle activate that genetic code.
And those environmental triggers extend far beyond the standard medical warnings about sedentary behavior or drinking too many sugar-sweetened beverages. There is a deeply psychological trigger detailed in the research that fundamentally shifts how we should view metabolic health.
The inclusion of psychosocial factors, particularly stress and trauma, as direct physiological triggers for type 2 diabetes is a relatively recent but massive clinical realization.
The data specifically points to adverse childhood experiences, or ACEs. We are talking about severe childhood trauma, abuse, neglect, and profound household dysfunction. The research indicates that experiencing these ACEs increases the likelihood of developing type 2 diabetes decades later by 32%.
And childhood neglect demonstrates the strongest correlation of all.
A 32% increase is a massive statistical jump.
It is, and it forces us to understand how trauma alters neurobiology. Chronic, severe stress in childhood does not remain confined to the psyche. It fundamentally and permanently rewires the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis, which is the body's central stress response system.
It keeps them locked in a state of high alert.
Yes, it keeps the individual in a prolonged state of fight or flight, chronically flooding the bloodstream with stress hormones like cortisol.
And cortisol actively antagonizes insulin.
Right, it does. Cortisol's primary evolutionary function is to mobilize energy for immediate physical action. It tells the liver to dump glucose into the blood, and it simultaneously creates temporary insulin resistance in the muscles so that the glucose remains available for the brain and the immediate escape response.
For running away from a predator.
Exactly. But when a child experiences relentless trauma, that cortisol flood never subsides. Over decades, this chronic hormonal barrage structurally damages the body's insulin sensitivity, completely independent of what they're eating.
Wow. It completely reframes the disease from a simplistic moral failing of eating poorly into a complex biological history of survival. And that complexity deepens when we look at the diagnostic gray areas. The World Health Organization actually classifies diabetes into 6 distinct categories, recognizing that the binary of type 1 and type 2 is clinically insufficient.
There are several rare or frequently misdiagnosed forms of the disease that blur the lines between autoimmune and metabolic dysfunction.
Here's where it gets really interesting. Let's explore LADA first. Latent autoimmune diabetes of adults. In medical circles, this is sometimes unofficially referred to as type 1.5.
LAD is, at its core, type 1 diabetes. It is a targeted autoimmune destruction of the pancreatic beta cells. However, the progression is remarkably slow, and it presents in adulthood.
Which creates a massive diagnostic blind spot.
Huge.
A 45-year-old patient presents with rising blood sugar levels. Because of their age, the attending physician defaults to a type 2 diagnosis, assuming it's insulin resistance. They prescribe lifestyle modifications and metformin.
But those interventions will inevitably fail because the root cause isn't resistance. Their beta cells are quietly being eradicated.
Exactly. They have some residual insulin production, which delays the onset of severe symptoms like ketoacidosis, but they are slowly marching toward absolute insulin dependency. It is a tragic misclassification driven purely by demographic assumptions.
Then you have conditions driven by highly specific genetic anomalies like MODY or maturity onset diabetes of the young.
The name itself sounds like a clinical contradiction. Maturity onset of the young.
It is a historical artifact from earlier hypotheses. MODY is exceedingly rare, accounting for only 1 to 2% of cases. Unlike type 1 or type 2, which involve highly complex polygenic webs of multiple genes interacting with the environment, MODY is an autosomal dominant inherited form. It is caused by a single gene mutation.
Meaning, if one parent carries a mutation, a child has a 50% chance of inheriting the disease directly, regardless of lifestyle or autoimmune factors.
Precisely. And because it traces back to a singular genetic defect, researchers have identified at least 14 distinct subtypes of MODY, depending on exactly which gene is broken.
That's incredibly specific.
It is, and the clinical significance of recognizing MODY is profound, because many patients with certain subtypes can manage their blood sugar entirely with oral medications called sulfonylureas, or even just through diet. They bypass the need for lifelong, burdensome insulin injections that a misdiagnosis of type 1 would bring.
Which would be life-changing for a patient. And moving from genetic anomalies to environmental extremes, we have type 5, which is the unofficial designation for malnutrition-related diabetes.
This form of the disease really highlights how fragile the pancreas is under severe physiological duress. In type 5, the pancreas ceases to produce insulin, similar to type 1, but there is no autoimmune attack.
It's just starvation.
Yes. The destruction is caused by severe, chronic, long-term malnutrition. The starvation literally atrophies the pancreas, destroying its endocrine function.
But they don't get ketoacidosis.
Curiously, no. These patients rarely develop the dangerous ketosis seen in type 1. The World Health Organization actually maintained a specific diagnostic code for this in the 1990s. While they later deprecated it in their official taxonomy to streamline classifications, researchers in developing nations still heavily utilize the concept to describe the metabolic fallout of chronic famine.
The research also wades into some deeply controversial, cutting-edge theories, specifically regarding cognitive decline. There is a growing body of researchers referring to Alzheimer's disease as type 3 diabetes.
It is a chilling paradigm shift in neurology. Researchers are finding compelling evidence of severe insulin resistance localized entirely within the brain tissue.
So just the brain cells are resistant.
Right. The neurons in the brain, much like muscle cells, rely heavily on insulin signaling to absorb glucose for energy. If the brain develops insulin resistance, those neurons lose their ability to access fuel. They effectively starve, leading to synaptic breakdown, memory loss, and the progressive cognitive decline characteristic of Alzheimer's.
That is terrifying.
It is. While the broader medical community has not universally adopted the type 3 label, primarily to avoid confusing patients with classic diabetes, the metabolic connection between brain health and insulin signaling is currently one of the most intensely studied areas in neuroscience today.
And as if the individual types weren't complex enough, the pathology can actually stack. The research details double diabetes, a scenario where a patient who already has classic type 1 diabetes, meaning they produce zero endogenous insulin, subsequently develops the hallmark feature of type 2 systemic insulin
It's
resistance.
a double blow.
Right, they are injecting the required synthetic insulin to survive, but their body's tissues begin ignoring the synthetic signal due to weight gain, chronic stress, or genetic predisposition. It requires massive, ever-increasing doses of insulin just to maintain a baseline.
It is a stark reminder of the compounding nature of metabolic dysfunction. When the energy economy breaks down, the resulting damage is never isolated.
So, what does this all mean when we zoom out? Which transitions us to the macro impact. When we look at the 828 million people affected, the economic and physiological toll is almost incomprehensible. The global expenditure on diabetes-related healthcare sits at an estimated $760 billion annually.
It's a staggering drain on resources.
And it is currently the seventh leading cause of death globally. But what is truly alarming is the geographic shift in prevalence.
The epicenter of the epidemic is moving rapidly. Historically, diabetes was viewed as a disease of affluent, developed nations. Today, the most dramatic, explosive increases in prevalence are occurring in low- and middle-income nations, particularly across Asia and Africa.
More than 80% of all diabetic deaths now occur in these regions.
Exactly. This shift is driven by rapid urbanization and the global nutrition transition. As populations move from agrarian lifestyles with high physical activity into densely packed urban centers with sedentary labor, the environment changes completely.
The food system changes entirely.
Traditional fiber-rich diets are aggressively replaced by the Western-style diet foods engineered for maximum shelf life and caloric density, loaded with saturated fats, refined carbohydrates, and added sugars, completely stripped of nutritional value.
It is a forced, rapid environmental change that outpaces our genetic adaptation. But to understand the true cost of this disease, we have to look at what that prolonged exposure to high blood sugar actually does to the human anatomy over decades. Hyperglycemia is effectively toxic to the vascular system.
It destroys the blood vessels. The long-term complications are medically divided into two categories based on the size of the blood vessels being destroyed: macrovascular and microvascular.
Let's start with macro.
Macrovascular complications refer to the damage inflicted on the body's large arteries. Chronic high blood sugar damages the delicate endothelial cells lining the blood vessels. This damage accelerates atherosclerosis, which is the hardening and narrowing of the arteries due to plaque buildup.
And that leads to heart attacks.
Yes. As a result, diabetes doubles the risk of cardiovascular disease. Roughly 75% of all deaths in diabetic patients are ultimately caused by coronary artery disease. It also drastically elevates the risk of severe strokes and peripheral artery disease, choking off blood flow to the limbs.
But the microvascular complications, the destruction of the microscopic, fragile capillary beds, are where you see the most specific, localized devastation.
These tiny vessels bear the absolute brunt of the toxic sugar load. In the eyes, this manifests as diabetic retinopathy. The capillaries feeding the retina weaken, leak fluid, and hemorrhage, making diabetes the leading cause of new-onset blindness in working-age adults.
And what about the kidneys?
In the kidneys, it causes diabetic nephropathy. The microscopic filtration units, called glomeruli, are essentially scarred and destroyed by the osmotic pressure and sugar toxicity. This accounts for over 50% of all patients requiring dialysis in the United States.
Over half of all dialysis patients.
Yes.
And then there's the nerve damage, diabetic neuropathy.
Neuropathy is perhaps the most insidious complication. The high glucose levels damage the vasa nervorum, the tiny blood vessels that supply oxygen and nutrients directly to the peripheral nerves.
So the nerves are literally suffocating.
Yes, the nerves begin to die. This manifests initially as agonizing neuropathic pain, tingling, or a complete loss of sensation, typically starting in the extremities like the toes and feet.
And that sensory loss is what creates the pathway to amputation.
Exactly. If a patient cannot feel pain in their foot, a minor injury, a blister from a tight shoe, a small pebble goes completely unnoticed. Because the macrovascular disease has already compromised blood flow to the area, the immune system cannot reach the wound to heal it.
So it just worsens.
It ulcerates, becomes deeply infected, turns gangrenous, and necessitates surgical amputation to save the patient's life. Diabetes remains the undisputed leading cause of non-traumatic lower limb amputations globally.
It's horrific. And the secondary complications extend even further. The research links chronic diabetes to significant hearing loss, an elevated risk of gallstones, and as we discussed with the brain metabolism, a significantly higher risk of vascular dementia and cognitive decline.
And the earlier in life a patient is diagnosed, the steeper that trajectory of cognitive decline becomes.
When you map out that level of systemic whole-body failure, it becomes clear that surviving diabetes requires immense resources. And those resources are not distributed equally. The sociological data surrounding this disease reveals glaring structural inequalities.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, looking objectively at the demographic data, particularly within the United States, the disparities are stark. While the average U.S. adult faces a roughly 40% chance of developing type 2 diabetes in their lifetime, Hispanic and Latino adults face a greater than 50% probability.
More than half.
African American populations also face disproportionately higher rates of diagnosis and complications compared to white Americans.
And beyond the socioeconomic factors, there are distinct physiological differences in how different populations manifest the disease, too. Asian populations, for example, have a significantly elevated risk profile at lower thresholds. They tend to develop insulin resistance and type 2 diabetes at a much lower body mass index compared to other populations.
Which fundamentally alters the diagnostic criteria.
It has to, right?
It has to. The distribution of visceral fat, the dangerous, metabolically active fat surrounding the internal organs, is structurally different. They can develop the disease at a younger age and with lower overall body fat. The danger here is that standard screening guidelines, which rely heavily on generalized BMI cutoffs, often miss these patients entirely.
They don't look at risk on paper.
Exactly. The research indicates that diabetes is severely underreported in Asian American communities, with an estimated 1 in 3 cases going completely undiagnosed until severe microvascular complications appear.
The economic divide is just as lethal. A 2010 public health metric cited in the document showed that diabetes-related emergency room visits were wildly disproportionate based on income. Rates were more than double for individuals from the lowest income communities compared to those in the highest tax brackets.
Because poverty directly restricts access to preventative primary care.
Right, and it heavily limits access to fresh, nutrient-dense foods and often dictates living in environments lacking safe infrastructure for physical activity. This drives up both the initial incidence of the disease and the severity of the terminal complications.
And compounding the physical and economic burden is the psychological toll of societal stigma. There is a pervasive, highly destructive public narrative that frames type 2 diabetes purely as a moral failing, a disease of laziness and gluttony.
A narrative that completely ignores the established science on genetic heritability, the visceral impact of childhood trauma that we just discussed, and the structural realities of food deserts and poverty.
And the stigma yields highly documented negative clinical outcomes. The research details how this prejudice affects social standing, employment opportunities, and in certain cultures, even marriage prospects. Internally, the self-stigma drives profound shame, leading to significantly higher rates of clinical depression.
Patients often conceal their diagnosis, don't
Yes, they avoid testing their blood sugar in public, and they delay seeking critical medical interventions, leading to poorer long-term survival rates.
The data also highlights a severe gender disparity in how the burden is carried. Women experience markedly higher rates of mental health comorbidities stemming from diabetes management, including specific eating disorders tied to insulin omission for weight control.
Which is incredibly dangerous.
Furthermore, societal pressures and the lack of systemic support mean women are 3 times more likely to become housebound due to the complications of the disease. And perhaps the most glaring inequity, the clinical data shows that while women actively seek out more medical assistance for their diabetes than men, they statistically receive less aggressive treatment and fewer therapeutic interventions from healthcare providers across the same racial and economic demographics.
The bias is baked into the care.
The text also briefly notes the compounding challenges faced by transgender individuals who report systemic barriers to receiving inclusive preventative diabetes care.
It paints an objective picture of a metabolic crisis that ruthlessly exploits existing societal fault lines.
So, when faced with this level of systemic breakdown, how does modern medicine intervene? How do we artificially manage a siphon that refuses to close?
The entire philosophy of management is centered on mimicking the healthy pancreas's tight control over blood glucose. The clinical objective is to maintain blood sugar levels as close to the normal physiological range as possible, thereby delaying or preventing the toxic macro and microvascular damage.
And the gold standard for tracking that success over time is the HbA1c test.
Yes, the A1C.
Instead of just a daily finger prick showing a momentary snapshot, the HbA1c measures glycation. It essentially calculates the percentage of hemoglobin proteins in your red blood cells that have become coated with sugar.
Since red blood cells live for about 120 days, this gives doctors a highly accurate 2 to 3 month average of your blood sugar control. For most patients, the therapeutic goal is maintaining an HbA1c below 7%.
Achieving that target requires entirely different strategies depending on the pathology. For type 1 diabetes, because the endogenous insulin production is zero, there is no biological workaround. The patient must manually replace the missing hormone.
This is conventionally managed via a basal bolus regimen. The patient injects a long-acting basal insulin to provide a steady background level, covering the body's basic metabolic needs throughout the day, coupled with rapid-acting bolus insulin injections, calculated and timed precisely with every meal to handle the immediate influx of dietary carbohydrates.
For type 2 diabetes, because the underlying issue is cellular resistance and metabolic dysfunction rather than an absolute lack of insulin, the intervention pyramid is much broader. The foundational tier is intensive lifestyle modification.
And the clinical data is robust here. Engaging in high levels of physical activity, specifically exceeding 90 minutes of exercise per day, is associated with a massive 28% reduction in the risk of developing diabetes.
90 minutes is a lot, but 28% is huge.
Furthermore, significant weight loss, particularly the reduction of visceral fat, can sometimes force type 2 diabetes into a state of partial or even prolonged remission, restoring beta cell function and insulin sensitivity.
But when lifestyle modifications are insufficient to overcome the genetic and environmental resistance, pharmacological intervention becomes necessary. The universal first-line oral medication is metformin.
It is a brilliant, decades-old drug that targets the liver's panic response. Metformin specifically suppresses gluconeogenesis, telling the liver to stop manufacturing and dumping excess glucose into the bloodstream, while simultaneously increasing the peripheral tissue's sensitivity to the circulating insulin.
And the pharmaceutical arsenal has expanded dramatically in recent years with entirely new classes of drugs. SGLT2 inhibitors physically force the kidneys to lower their reabsorption threshold, actively flushing excess glucose out through the urine.
And the GLP-1 agonists.
Yes, GLP-1 agonists mimic the body's natural incretin hormones, stimulating the pancreas to release more insulin only when food is present, while significantly slowing gastric emptying and signaling satiety to the brain, which often results in profound weight loss.
Beyond pharmaceuticals, we're also seeing mechanical and surgical solutions applied to this metabolic crisis. Bariatric surgery, various procedures that physically alter the digestive tract to restrict food intake and alter gut hormones, is highly effective. It frequently allows patients with severe type 2 diabetes to maintain normal HbA1c levels with minimal or completely eliminated reliance on diabetes medications.
But the surgical intervention that I found the most surprising deals with the neuropathy we discussed earlier. The prevailing medical theory has long been that diabetic nerve pain is exclusively a chemical death, the toxic sugar levels simply asphyxiating the peripheral nerves. But the research introduces multiple nerve decompression surgery.
Right. It applies an orthopedic mechanical solution to a metabolic problem. The elevated blood sugar causes the peripheral nerves to physically swell and increase in volume. Because these nerves run through naturally tight anatomical bottlenecks in the human body, like the carpal tunnel in the wrist or the tarsal tunnel in the ankle, the swollen nerves become physically entrapped and compressed against the surrounding ligaments and bone.
So the pain isn't just chemical, it's an extreme, chronic pinching of the nerve.
Correct. Surgeons can intervene by physically snipping the tight, constricting ligaments, thereby decompressing the trapped nerve. The clinical outcomes are remarkable. Decompression surgery is strongly associated with dramatically lower pain scores, the physical restoration of sensation in the extremities, a massive reduction in the formation of foot ulcers, and ultimately, a significant drop in the amputation rate.
It really highlights how intertwined the metabolic and mechanical systems of the body truly are. And speaking of physiological connections, I want to make a fascinating pivot. In examining all this human suffering, this global epidemic, the research provides a surprising aside. We are absolutely not alone in this metabolic struggle.
No, we aren't.
Diabetes exists robustly throughout the animal kingdom.
The veterinary data is extensive. Domestic dogs and cats develop diabetes at remarkably high rates, and the epidemiology mirrors our own in bizarrely specific ways.
The demographics for our pets are incredibly distinct. For dogs, the disease overwhelmingly strikes middle-aged females, who are twice as likely to develop the condition as their male counterparts. Furthermore, genetics play a huge role. with certain small breeds, specifically miniature poodles and Samoyeds, carrying an exponentially higher risk profile.
Conversely, the feline data skews in the opposite direction. Certain studies indicate that male cats are significantly more prone to developing diabetes than females. There are distinct genetic breed predispositions here as well, with the Burmese, Russian Blue, and Abyssinian breeds showing elevated risk. And much like the human epidemic, overweight and obese felines represent the vast majority of cases.
Feline diabetes is actually shockingly similar in its pathophysiology to human type 2 diabetes, isn't it?
It is. The cats develop severe insulin resistance driven by obesity and inactivity, followed by beta cell exhaustion. And the treatment protocols for both Fido and Fluffy are identical to human interventions.
Aggressive weight management, highly specific low-carbohydrate diets, oral anti-diabetic medications, and daily subcutaneous insulin injections.
Yep. Pet owners have to learn to monitor their animals for the exact same lethal ketoacidosis that human patients face.
However, looking across the broader animal kingdom, the research highlights a staggering evolutionary anomaly. While mammals struggle with glucose regulation, birds never get diabetes.
Never.
Not a single avian species.
It does not exist in their pathology. Their metabolic engine operates on an entirely different physiological paradigm. Birds naturally circulate blood glucose at extraordinarily high concentrations levels that would instantly trigger severe osmotic diuresis, blind a human, and utterly destroy a mammalian kidney within weeks.
Wow.
Yet, they have evolved a complete natural tolerance to this glycemic load. Their endothelial cells and microvasculature are structurally immune to the toxic effects of the sugar.
It makes you wonder if the key to truly curing the vascular damage in humans lies somewhere in the genetic sequencing of a pigeon's kidney. It is a profound biological mystery.
It absolutely is.
And that evolutionary quirk brings us to the end of our journey today. We have covered a truly massive amount of ground, exploring a condition that touches billions of lives. We started back in 230 BCE with Apollonius of Memphis recognizing a devastating siphon, tracked through the visceral reality of honey urine diagnostics, and unpacked the deeply complex internal cellular cascade of insulin signaling and glucose transport.
We examined the hidden diagnostic spectrum moving beyond the binary of type 1 and type 2 to recognize the slow autoimmune decay of LADA, the single gene mutations of MERY, the atrophy of malnutrition, and the terrifying prospect of Alzheimer's as localized brain starvation.
We looked impartially at the objective sociological data, documenting how this 828 million person epidemic exploits poverty, punishes marginalized populations, and fundamentally alters global economics. And we explored the arsenal of interventions we deploy to fight back, from GLP-1 agonists to mechanical nerve decompression, for both ourselves and our miniature poodles.
This raises an important question to consider as we close. We know from the epidemiological data that the explosive global rise of this disease is fundamentally driven by globalization, rapid urbanization, and the aggressive expansion of the Western diet. These are not individual failings. These are massive societal shifts.
Structural shifts.
Exactly. So the question we must ask is this. If our modern built environments, our sedentary labor structures, and our global food supply chains are inherently diabetogenic, meaning they are literally engineered in a way that shatters our natural metabolic limits, can we ever expect pharmaceutical treatments and insulin injections alone to save us? Or will stemming this epidemic require us to radically, systematically redesign our cities, our work lives, and our global agriculture to finally match the ancient genetics we still carry?
A heavy, complex, but absolutely necessary thought to end on. Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive into the source material. We hope you walk away with a richer, more profound understanding of the mechanics and the magnitude of a condition that shapes so much of our modern world. Keep questioning the systems around you, keep looking for the bigger picture, and we will see you next time. Welcome back to the deep dive. Today we're going to try and do something that sounds, well, frankly impossible. We are going to try to see the invisible.
Or at least understand the monumental effort it takes to keep things from being seen.
Exactly. You know, when I think of stealth, my brain immediately goes to pop culture.
Oh, yeah.
I'm thinking of the Klingon bird of prey in Star Trek cloaking and just disappearing, or, Wonder Woman's invisible jet.
Right. The magic button.
Yeah, the magic button. I think for most of us, stealth equals magic invisibility cloak. You just flip a switch and poof, you're gone.
It's a fun image, isn't it? The idea that you can just vanish from the human eye. But the reality of low observable technology, which is the technical term for stealth, is a lot more grounded.
Low observable, L-O-H-O.
Right. It's a lot more mathematical. And honestly, I think it's a lot more interesting than the sci-fi version because of the sheer physics involved.
Okay, so, LO. Right off the bat, let's adjust our definitions. We aren't talking about being invisible to the naked eye, are we? If I walk up to a B-2 bomber on a runway, I can see it. It's a giant metal object.
You can absolutely see it. In fact, visual stealth, hiding from the human eyeball, is actually the oldest and, in some ways, the least high-tech part of the equation today.
So what are we talking about then?
Modern stealth is really about managing the electromagnetic spectrum. It's about defeating sensors, radar, infrared, sonar. It is about breaking what they call the kill chain.
The kill chain, that sounds intense.
It is. In military doctrine, for an enemy to shoot you down, they have to do 4 things. You have to detect you, track you, target you, and then engage you. Stealth is about breaking that chain at step 1.
At detection.
Right. If the radar can't see you until you're, say, 5 miles away, but you have a missile that can shoot 20 miles, you win. You are, for all intents and purposes, invisible.
Okay, so it's not magic, it's physics. And it's about shrinking that detection range way, way down.
Precisely. Think of it this way. Imagine you're standing in a pitch-black field at night. You have a giant spotlight.
Okay.
If you point that light at a barn door, a huge amount of light is going to bounce right back at you, right? You see the barn door clearly.
Right. Big flat surface, big reflection, simple.
Now, imagine you point that same spotlight at a single black marble suspended in the air 100 yards away.
I'm barely going to see a reflection if I see anything at all.
Exactly. The goal of stealth technology is to turn a massive bomber aircraft, which is essentially a flying barn door, into that marble. It's about reducing the signature so that by the time the enemy sensors pick it up, it's already too late.
That is a perfect starting point. We are turning barn doors into marbles. And to understand how we got there, we have quite a roadmap ahead of us today.
We do.
We are going to dig into the surprisingly ironic origins of stealth technology. And spoiler alert, it involves a Soviet scientist whose own government just completely ignored him.
Oh, it's one of the great ironies of the Cold War. The equation for American air superiority was literally written in Moscow.
We're going to break down the mechanics, the shapes, the special paints, this weird physics of glitter.
And we're going to look at the future, where planes might fly without any moving parts at all.
It's a wild trajectory. So let's rewind. Before we had F-117s and B-2 bombers, humans have always been trying to hide in war. I assume this starts with just wearing green in the forest.
Essentially, yes. I mean, hunters have used vegetation for millennia. Sun Tzu wrote about visual concealment in The Art of War way back in the 5th century BC.
Right.
But if we're looking for the technological ancestors of modern stealth, we really have to look at World War I.
And I found this part of the research fascinating because there were some spectacular failures. I think we assume technology always moves forward, but sometimes it takes a hard left turn into bad idea.
Oh, absolutely.
Tell me about the Cellon experiment.
Oh, this is a classic example of good idea on paper, terrible in practice. So in 1915, radar didn't exist. The only sensor that mattered was the Mark I eyeball.
You look up, you see a plane, you shoot at it.
That's it. So German engineers thought, what if the plane was transparent?
Like Wonder Woman's jet.
Exactly. They experimented with a material called Cellon, which is a type of cellulose acetate. It's like a thick, rigid plastic wrap.
Okay, so they just wrapped a plane in it.
They actually stripped the canvas off entire aircraft, the Fokker E-3, the Albatross CI, and wrapped the whole skeleton of the plane in this clear Cellon. The idea was, if the skin of the plane is clear, you can't see it against the sky.
In theory, that makes sense. If the sky is blue, the plane is blue. If it's cloudy, the plane is cloudy.
In theory. In practice, it was a nightmare. First, the material degraded really fast. Sunlight turned it yellow.
Oh, no.
So after a couple of weeks, you aren't flying an invisible plane. You're flying a sickly, nicotine yellow plane that stands out against everything.
Gross. And probably not great for morale, flying a yellow plane.
It gets worse. Cellon is plastic, so it expands and contracts with temperature. At high altitude, it's freezing, so the skin shrinks, gets brittle.
And on the ground.
On the tarmac in the summer, it expands and sags. It literally changed the aerodynamics of the plane while you were flying it. It vibrated. It drummed. Pilots said it was like flying inside a giant kazoo.
That sounds terrifying.
But the real stealth killer was the sun itself. When the sun hit that transparent skin, it didn't just pass through. It glinted.
So instead of an invisible plane, you had a giant flying mirror.
Basically a disco ball over the trenches.
Yeah.
It made the aircraft more visible, not less. And you have to imagine the pilot's experience. You're sitting in a transparent cockpit. You look down, and there is no floor. Just your boots and the ground 5,000 feet below.
Oh, Vertigo City.
Exactly. So the effort to make visually transparent aircraft was pretty quickly abandoned.
Okay, so visual transparency is a bust. But then we get to World War II, and we start seeing the beginning of sensor stealth, specifically with submarines.
Right. We have to talk about the Battle of the Atlantic. The primary sensor here isn't eyes anymore. It's ASDIC, or what we now call sonar.
Ping. Ping.
Precisely that. Active sonar sends out a sound wave. It travels through the water, hits the metal hull of a U-boat, and bounces back to the destroyer on the surface.
So how do you hide from sound?
You change the impedance.
Okay, hold on. Unpack that word for me. Impedance.
Sure. So in physics, when a wave, whether it's sound or radar, moves from one medium to another, like from water to steel, the difference in density causes a reflection. If the difference is huge, the reflection is huge. That's called an impedance mismatch.
So you need to make the transition from water to the hull smoother somehow.
Exactly. The Germans developed a coating called Elbrich, named after the invisible dwarf in German mythology. It was a layer of rubber tiles, about 4 millimeters thick. But here's the clever part. It wasn't just solid rubber. Inside the rubber, they drilled a specific pattern of circular air holes.
Air holes. Why?
To tune the density. The sound wave hits the rubber, enters those air cavities, and just bounces around inside them. The energy gets trapped and converted into a tiny amount of heat. It absorbs the ping instead of reflecting it.
That is incredibly clever. Did it actually work in combat?
It worked terrifyingly well. The U-480 was the first sub to use it. It operated in the English Channel, the most heavily defended water on Earth, and sank 4 ships. The British destroyers just couldn't get a lock on it. They reported the sonar echoes were fuzzy or non-existent.
Wow. Did it survive the war?
It did, right up until it hit a naval mine, which, sadly for the crew, stealth coatings can't protect you from. But the principle was proven. If you can absorb the energy of this sensor, you disappear.
And there's also something called diffuse lighting on ships. This one sounded totally counterintuitive to me, using lights to hide.
This is one of my favorite obscure technologies. It's called counter-illumination. So think about a ship on the horizon at night. Even if the ship is painted black, if there's any moonlight or starlight behind it, the ship appears as a black silhouette against the slightly lighter sky.
You are a black hole in the light.
Right. You are negative space. So the Royal Canadian Navy and the U.S. Navy experimented with what they called Yehudi lights. They put diffused lights on the ship or on the leading edge of an airplane wing to match the background brightness of the sky.
So you are basically filling in your own shadow with light.
Exactly. You're trying to achieve the same brightness as the background so there is no contrast. In 1945, a Grumman Avenger aircraft equipped with Yehudi lights could get within 3,000 yards of a ship before being sighted.
3,000 yards. What was it without the lights?
Without the lights, it would be spotted from 12 miles away.
That is a massive difference. That's the difference between getting shot down and dropping your torpedo before they even know you're there.
It is. But then, of course, the villain of our story arrives.
Yeah.
Radar.
Radar ruins the party.
It changes absolutely everything. Visual stealth became secondary. If you can be seen by radio waves from 50 miles away, it doesn't matter if you're painted and invisible or covered in lights.
And this brings us right to the Cold War and the famous U-2 spy plane. I think a lot of people know the U-2. It's that long, skinny, glider-looking plane. The Dragon Lady. The CIA thought this thing was untouchable, right?
That was the whole assumption. In the mid-50s, the CIA believed that if they just flew high enough, we're talking 70,000 feet or more, that Soviet radar couldn't track them. And Soviet missiles couldn't reach them. It wasn't about stealth. It was about pure altitude.
Spoiler alert, they were wrong.
Oh, very wrong. The Soviets tracked the U-2 almost immediately on its first flights. The radar operators could see it clearly, they just couldn't reach it yet. But the CIA knew it was only a matter of time before the missiles caught up.
So they started scrambling.
They started scrambling for a way to hide the plane from radar. And this leads us to Project Rainbow and the Dirty Birds.
Dirty Birds. It sounds like a bad sports team. What were they?
It was a desperate attempt to retrofit stealth onto a plane that wasn't designed for it. They were trying to reduce the radar cross-section, or RCS. They literally strung wires with ferrite beads around the aircraft. They tried gluing a sort of radar-absorbing wallpaper inside the
My
fuselage.
wallpaper. You're kidding.
Basically, a honeycomb material meant to trap radar waves. But you have to remember, the U-2 is a delicate flower. It flies at the very edge of physics, what pilots call the coffin corner.
Why coffin corner?
Because at 70,000 feet, the air is so thin that the stall speed and the maximum speed are only a few knots apart. If you slow down a tiny bit, you fall out of the sky. If you speed up a tiny bit, the wings rip off.
And they decided to glue heavy wallpaper to this thing.
Exactly. It added weight and drag. The dirty birds were a disaster. The heat from the engine got trapped by the insulation, and it cooked the internal systems. The wires on the outside created so much drag that it lowered the flight ceiling. So instead of being invisible at 70,000 feet, they were highly visible at 65,000 feet.
So they realized they couldn't just slap stealth onto an existing plane like a sticker.
Exactly. You can't just retrofit stealth. It has to be in the DNA of the design.
Yeah.
And that realization led to the A-12 Oxcart, which was the precursor to the SR-71 Blackbird.
The coolest looking plane in history, period.
Hard to argue with that.
Yeah.
And the A-12 was the first to really integrate shape into the stealth equation. They used canted vertical stabilizers, tilted fins to deflect radar. They used composite materials. They even used a special fuel designed to reduce the signature of the exhaust plume.
But even the A-12 and the SR-71 weren't invisible to radar, right? They were just smaller on radar and really, really fast.
Right. They still relied on speed. Their motto was basically, if you see me, good luck catching me. But the dream of true invisibility, of being a ghost on the radar screen, that required a breakthrough in mathematics.
And here's the twist that I absolutely love. The breakthrough came from the Soviet Union.
It did. The ultimate irony.
Introduce us to Pyotr Ufantsev.
Pyotr Ufantsev was a brilliant Soviet physicist working at the Moscow Institute of Radio Engineering. In 1962, he published a book with the incredibly catchy title method of edge waves in the physical theory of diffraction.
I'm sure that was a bestseller. Flew off the shelves.
I think it sold a few hundred copies, maybe. But the content was revolutionary. See, before Ufantsev, we knew how to calculate radar reflection for simple shapes, a sphere, a cylinder, a flat plate. But a complex shape, like an airplane, it was just a guessing game.
Why was it so hard?
Because radar doesn't just bounce off the flat parts. It diffracts off the edges. It sort of ripples around corners like water around a rock. Ufantsev developed the equations that could calculate exactly how a radar wave would scatter off the edge of a two-dimensional shape.
So he gave us the formula. If you build a shape this way, the radar will go that way.
Exactly. He turned stealth from an art into a predictable science.
So why didn't the Soviet Union build a stealth bomber in 1962? They had the book. The guy worked for them.
This is the tragedy of bureaucracy. The Soviet senior engineers looked at his math and said, this is interesting theoretically, but it's useless for airplanes.
Why useless?
Because the equations only worked well for flat, faceted surfaces, triangles. And as any aerodynamicist will tell you, a plane made of flat triangles is a brick. It shouldn't fly. So the Soviets stamped the book unclassified and let him publish it openly.
They let the secret to invisibility walk right out the front door.
And walk right onto the desk of a translator at the U.S. Air Force Foreign Technology Division.
I just love this image. Some bored translator sifting through stacks of dry Russian physics papers and suddenly, wait a minute, what is this?
Effectively, yes. In 1971, the translation landed at Lockheed Martin's famous Skunk Works. And the head of Skunk Works, a guy named Ben Rich, read it. He realized that Ufantsev had just handed them the keys to the kingdom.
But there was a catch, right? You mentioned the Soviets didn't have the computing power.
Right. Even Lockheed's computers in the 1970s weren't powerful enough to simulate curved surfaces using Ufantsev's math. They could only calculate flat, faceted surfaces.
So that's why the F-117 Nighthawk looks like that. It looks like a low-polygon video game character from 1995, all jagged edges.
Exactly. It looks that way because that was the only shape that computers could handle. They called the design the hopeless diamond.
The hopeless diamond? Why hopeless?
Because aerodynamically, it was a catastrophe. A shape made of flat, jagged facets produces almost no lift and incredible amounts of drag. It had the aerodynamics of a falling leaf. One of the Skunk Works engineers famously looked at the blueprint and said to Ben Rich, "Ben, you've lost your mind. This thing will never get off the runway."
But they built it anyway.
They did, because they had an ace up their sleeve that the Soviets didn't consider. Fly-by-wire technology.
Computers flying the plane.
Exactly. The F-117 is inherently unstable. If you turned off the flight computers, it would tumble out of the sky in seconds. but the computer makes thousands of tiny adjustments per second to the control surfaces to keep it stable. We traded aerodynamic stability for invisibility.
That is a massive gamble. Okay, let's get into the how. We've been tossing around this term RCS, or radar cross-section. We need to unpack that. When we say we are reducing the RCS, what are we actually measuring?
We are measuring the size of the echo that returns to the radar station. It's usually measured in square meters. For comparison, a conventional fighter jet might have an RCS of maybe 5 square meters. A B-52 bomber is huge, maybe 100 square meters, that's your barn door.
And a stealth aircraft, the Marble.
A B-2 Spirit bomber, which has a wingspan of 172 feet, has the radar signature of a large insect, maybe a bumblebee.
That is mind-blowing. You have this massive metal object and the radar operator sees a bug. How? I want to get into the physics here.
It's a combination of two main things, shape and materials. Let's start with shape, specifically that hopeless diamond approach.
The facets.
Right. We need to talk about specular reflection.
Specular reflection, is that like a mirror?
Exactly like a mirror. Think about a round pole. If you shine a flashlight at a round pole, no matter where you stand, you see a highlight. There is always a point on the curve that is perpendicular to you, bouncing the light right back.
Because it's curved, it's scattering light everywhere.
Right. Curves are bad for stealth because they scatter energy in all directions. Now think about a flat mirror. If you shine a flashlight at a flat mirror at a 45-degree angle, where does the light go?
It bounces off at a 45-degree angle away from me. I don't see anything.
And you, holding the flashlight, see nothing. That is the principle of the facets. The F-117 is made of flat plates angled so that they deflect radar waves away from the source. They bounce the energy into the sky or into the ground, anywhere but back to the radar receiver.
But the plane has to be visible from some angle, right? I mean, the energy has to go somewhere.
It does. And this leads to a really clever concept called parallel alignment. If you look at a stealth plane, you'll notice that all the edges, the wings, the hatches, the air intakes, are aligned at the same few angles.
I have noticed that. Everything looks parallel. It has this very distinct look.
That is completely deliberate. The goal is to confine the radar return to a very specific narrow spike. So if the radar hits the plane from just the right angle, it will get a massive flash. They call it glitter.
Glitter. That sounds pretty, but also pretty dangerous.
It is. It's a momentary bright flash on the radar screen. But because the plane is moving at 600 miles per hour, that flash lasts for a millisecond and then it's gone. To the radar operator, it just looks like a glitch or atmospheric noise. It doesn't look like a trackable target.
That is so clever. You take the reflection and you bundle it into a tiny beam that shoots off into nowhere, or it just blips for a second and vanishes.
Precisely. But shape can't do it all. Sometimes radar waves get trapped in cracks or hit parts of the plane that can't be faceted, or you have to deal with creeping waves that travel along the skin of the aircraft. That's where materials come in.
The sponge approach.
Yeah.
Radar absorbent material.
RAM, exactly. RAM.
I read about iron ball paint. That sounds incredibly heavy.
It is incredibly heavy. It's a paint that contains microscopic iron spheres coated in carbonyl iron or ferrite.
How does that work? Is it just blocking the wave like a shield?
No, it's converting it. This goes back to that idea of impedance. When the electromagnetic wave from the radar hits the iron sphere, it induces a magnetic field. It causes the molecules in the iron to oscillate.
It literally shakes them.
It shakes them. And that friction creates heat. It's called magnetic hysteresis. The paint literally eats the radar energy and turns it into a tiny, tiny amount of warmth.
So the energy goes in, but it doesn't come out. It just dissipates as heat.
Correct. But applying this stuff is a nightmare. It's toxic, it's heavy, and it has to be applied with robotic precision. If the thickness varies by even a fraction of a millimeter, the impedance matching fails and the plane starts to glow on radar.
What about the pilot? I mean, you have this super stealthy plane, but inside the cockpit, you have a pilot wearing a helmet. Isn't a helmet a giant radar reflector? It's round, it's hard.
It is. A pilot's helmet inside a cockpit is a corner reflector just waiting to happen. The radar goes through the glass, hits the helmet, bounces off the back of the seat, and comes right back out. It's basically a radar beacon.
So how do you fix that? You can't paint the pilot in iron ball paint.
You treat the glass, they coat the canopy in a very, very thin film of gold or indium tin oxide.
Gold, like actual gold.
Just a few atoms thick. It's conductive. To a radar wave, which has a long wavelength, that gold layer looks like a solid metal wall. The radar hits the canopy and just flows over it like it's part of the fuselage.
But the pilot can still see out.
Yep, because light waves are tiny enough to pass right through the gaps in the gold mesh. Like a microwave door. You can see your food cooking, but the microwaves can't get out.
That is wild. Gold-plated windows to hide the pilot. But we touched on this earlier, there is a trade-off. We talked about the aerodynamic instability. Is that still true for the newer planes? The B-2 looks smooth. It doesn't look like a diamond.
The B-2 Spirit represents the second generation. By the late 80s, supercomputers had finally caught up. We could now calculate the radar cross-section of curved surfaces, so we could move away from the hopeless diamond and build the continuous curvature.
The flying wing.
Right, the B-2 is a masterpiece of complex curvature, and you'll notice it has no vertical tail.
Wait, no tail? How does it steer?
That's the trick. A vertical tail is a radar disaster. It sticks straight up and reflects everything. So the B-2 uses drag rudders, split flaps on the wingtips that open up to create drag on one side or the other to turn the plane. And again, a massive amount of computer power keeps it pointing straight.
It really feels like stealth is just a constant battle against the laws of physics.
It is. And we've only talked about radar. If you conquer radar, you still have other problems.
Heat, infrared.
Exactly.
Yes.
Missiles like the Sidewinder track heat. And jet engines are essentially giant blowtorches. Hiding that heat signature is a huge challenge.
So how do they do it?
A few different ways. First, if you look at the tailpipes of the F-117 or the F-22, they aren't round. They are slit-shaped or rectangular.
Why does the shape matter for heat?
It spreads out the exhaust plume. A round pipe creates a concentrated core of hot gas that travels a long way. A wide, flat nozzle spreads that gas out, which increases the surface area so it mixes faster with the cool ambient air.
Ah, so you're cooling the exhaust faster, making it harder to see.
Exactly. The B-2 bomber takes it a step further. It vents its exhaust on top of the wing.
On top. But why?
So the body of the aircraft physically blocks the heat signature from any ground-based sensors. The wing itself acts as a shield. They also inject cool air into the exhaust stream before it even leaves the plane. It's called trenching.
So they're hiding the heat, masking the radar. What about sound? We talked about submarines, but what about helicopters, like the stealth Blackhawks that were supposedly used in the Bin Laden raid?
Right. Helicopters are loud. That thwop, thwop, thwop sound is very distinctive, and that sound comes from the tip of the rotor blade hitting the air turbulence created by the blade in front of it. It's a mini-sonic boom at the tip.
So how do you silence that?
You can't silence it completely, but you can disguise it. Some stealth helicopters use something called modulated blade spacing.
What does that mean?
The blades aren't spaced evenly around the hub. They're spaced at slightly different intervals. One might be at 90 degrees, the next at 85, the next at 95.
So it breaks up the rhythm.
It spreads the noise across a wider range of frequencies. Instead of a distinct rhythmic thwop that your brain and a sensor recognizes immediately, you get a softer, more white noise kind of sound. It just blends into the background wind.
That is fascinating. It's like breaking the pattern so the brain can't latch onto it.
That's a perfect way to describe it.
Then there's the visual aspect again. We talked about ship wakes in the outline. You can see a ship's wake from space with radar.
You can. Synthetic aperture radar satellites can see the wake pattern of a ship, even if they can't see the ship itself clearly. The wake persists for miles. And spray. When a ship cuts through waves, it throws up a cloud of water spray, radar hits that spray, and it lights up like a Christmas tree.
So how do you fix that?
Hull design. You design the hull to slice through the water with minimal disturbance. The Visby-class corvettes from Sweden or the U.S. Zumwalt-class destroyers have these tumble-home hulls.
Tumble-hum.
It means the hull slopes inward as it goes up, like a pyramid. This deflects radar, but the bow is also designed to pierce the wave rather than ride over it, which dramatically reduces the wake and spray.
Just seems like every time you solve one problem, another one pops up.
That is the history of warfare in a nutshell. Measure and countermeasure.
Speaking of countermeasures,
Right.
we are moving into the future. Because as good as stealth is, the sensors are getting better.
That is the inevitable march of technology. Moore's law applies to radar too.
So processing power.
Right. We talked about glitter earlier, those tiny fleeting flashes of radar return. In the 1980s, computers filtered those out as noise. Oh, that's just a bird or a cloud.
Right.
Today, computers are fast enough and smart enough to track those glitches, stitch them together using AI, and say, hey, that pattern of glitches is moving at 600 knots. That's a plane.
So the invisible plane is starting to flicker back into view.
To some extent, yes.
Yeah.
Especially against low-frequency radar.
Explain that. Why does low-frequency radar see stealth planes?
It's just simple physics.
Yeah.
Stealth shaping the facets and curves works best against high-frequency radar, the kinds used for targeting missiles. Those waves are short, centimeters long. They hit a facet and bounce off predictably. But low-frequency radar has wavelengths that are meters long,
Giant waves.
giant waves.
Yeah.
When a wave is the same size as the aircraft, the stealth shaping just stops working. The physics changes. The whole aircraft resonates. It's called Rayleigh scattering.
So if low-frequency radar can see them, why don't we just use that everywhere?
Because it's inaccurate.
Oh.
It can tell you there is something in that 5-mile area, but it can't tell you it is right here. You can't guide a missile with it. But it alerts the enemy that you are coming. It ruins the surprise.
So the cat and mouse game continues. Let's talk about the new frontiers, the stuff that sounds like pure sci-fi, metasurfaces.
This is exciting stuff. We talked about how the F-117 had to be faceted and the B-2 has to be a smooth flying wing. Metasurfaces could change all that. These are artificial materials with nanostructures that have properties that just don't exist in nature.
Like what?
Like a negative refractive index.
Okay, in English.
Think about a straw in a glass of water. It looks
Yeah.
bent, right? That's refraction. Metasurfaces can, theoretically, bend electromagnetic waves around an object. So instead of reflecting the wave or absorbing it, they could potentially guide the wave around the plane and out the other side.
Like water flowing around a rock.
Exactly. If the wave goes around you and continues on its path to the receiver, it looks like it never hit anything at all. That is true invisibility.
That is an actual cloaking device.
Theoretically, yes. We are a long way from putting it on a jet, but the physics is real.
And plasma stealth. That sounds like something straight out of a video game.
Plasma stealth is the idea of creating a cloud of ionized gas plasma around the vehicle.
Like a force field.
In a way, yeah. Plasma absorbs radio waves very, very effectively. If you can envelop the aircraft in a layer of plasma, the radar energy gets absorbed before it even hits the skin of the plane. The Soviets actually experimented with this on a missile project called Kulod.
So why aren't we doing this yet? What's the catch?
Energy. Generating a plasma cloud requires massive amounts of electricity. And there's another catch. Plasma glows
It glows.
brightly in the visible spectrum and the infrared. So you might be invisible to radar, but you're a glowing beacon to heat sensors and cameras.
Ah, the classic trade-off. You solve one problem, you create another.
Always.
But there is one development that seems very real and very imminent. The flapless plane. Fluidics.
This is the next big leap. I really believe that.
So explain the problem first. Conventional planes have flaps, rudders, ailerons, moving parts. Why is that bad for stealth?
Right. And every time a flap moves, it creates a gap. It creates a seam. And as we know, gaps reflect radar. Plus, they are heavy, they require hydraulics, they're complex.
So how do you fly without flaps?
You use air. It's called active flow control.
You fly the plane by blowing air on it.
Yes.
Yeah.
It relies on something called the Coanda effect. If you blow a high-speed jet of air over a curved surface, the air tends to stick to it and follow the curve. By blowing air out of tiny slots in the wing, you can bend the airflow. You can create lift or drag just by puffing air.
So you can steer, climb, and dive just by blowing air out of different slots. No moving metal.
Exactly. This allows for a completely seamless wing. No gaps, no hinges, no hydraulic actuators.
Is this just theoretical?
Not anymore. BAE Systems in the UK has already flown drones using this. The Demon and the Medjime. The Medjime drone maneuvered using only blown air. And right now, DARPA is building the X-65 Crane.
Crane. Control of revolutionary aircraft with novel effectors, of course.
The X-65 is designed to be a full-scale X-plane. They started construction in early 2024. They are aiming for a flight in 2025.
That is just around the corner.
It is. If it works, it could reduce the weight of aircraft by eliminating heavy hydraulic systems. It could reduce drag, and it could significantly improve stealth because you remove all those reflective gaps.
And it feels like we are moving from mechanical engineering to pure fluid dynamics. We aren't building machines anymore. We are building sculptures that manipulate air.
That's a beautiful way to put it.
So we've gone from the hopeless diamond, a brick that only flew because of computers, to smooth organic shapes that fly by blowing air. The evolution is just incredible.
It is a testament to how the constraints of physics can drive innovation. We couldn't beat the radar with brute force, so we had to outsmart it with geometry and chemistry and physics.
But I want to go back to that thought about fragility. You mentioned Moore's law. You mentioned that sensors are getting better. Is there a point where stealth becomes obsolete?
That is the big question in defense circles right now. There is a school of thought that says physical stealth, the shaping, the coatings, is approaching a point of diminishing returns.
Meaning we can't make the planes much stealthier than they already are.
Right. I mean, we're already down to the size of a bumblebee. Can we get to the size of a mosquito? Maybe. But the cost is astronomical. Meanwhile, the processing power to detect those tiny signals is getting cheaper and faster every single year.
So if the computer can process 1 billion signals a second, it can find the bumblebee and all that noise.
Exactly. And that raises the question, will the future of stealth not be about shape at all? Will it be about electronic warfare? Jamming, hacking the enemy's radar so it lies to the operator.
Or maybe something like quantum radar.
Quantum radar is the wild card. It uses entangled photons. If a photon hits the plane and bounces back, the entanglement changes. You can't hide from that. It doesn't rely on reflection intensity. It relies on quantum states. If that becomes real, physical stealth as we know it is dead.
It really makes you think. We spend billions developing these shapes, these paints, these incredible technologies, and it all hinges on the idea that the other guy's eyes or radar won't get sharper.
It's the Red Queen's race from Alice in Wonderland. You have to run as fast as you can just to stay in the same place.
So here is my final thought for everyone listening. We started with the idea of Wonder Woman's invisible jet. And in a way, we built it. We used math from a Soviet book, paint made of iron, and windows made of gold. But unlike magic, science doesn't stand still. The cloak of invisibility is only as good as the eyes looking for it.
And those eyes are always opening wider.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into the art of invisibility. We will see you, or maybe we won't, next time.
Take care.